The town called him broken. They were wrong. When Elias Crow rolled into Red Willow seeking a new life, the woman who promised to marry him took one look at his wheelchair and declared him incomplete in front of everyone. Most men would have left. Elias stayed. What happened next tore that frozen frontier town apart and forced everyone to question what strength really means. This is the story of a man who refused to be defined by other people's limits. Stay until the end. You won't believe how this turns out. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a hiss of steam and the screech of iron on iron. Elias Crow felt the vibration travel up, through the floor of the passenger car, and into the frame of his chair. A sensation he'd grown so accustomed to over the years that he barely registered it anymore. What he did register was the cold. Even through the window, even with the coal stove burning at the front of the car, he could feel the bite of winter waiting outside. Red Willow Station. End of the line. He pushed himself toward the door before the conductor could offer help he didn't need. The other passengers, a handful of miners, a family with 2 small children, an old woman clutching a carpet bag, had already begun gathering their things. None of them looked at him directly, but he caught the sidelong glances. He always did. The conductor, a rail-thin man with a mustache that drooped past his chin, appeared at the door. "Need a hand with—" "I'm fine." Elias's voice was flat, not rude, just matter-of-fact. The man hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. Getting down from a train wasn't easy, but Elias had designed his chair with exactly this kind of problem in mind. The wheels were larger than standard. The frame reinforced with steel he'd shaped himself in a Pittsburgh forge 3 years back. The footrests folded up. The armrests locked in place when he needed stability and pivoted out when he needed clearance. Every inch of it was custom, built to his specifications, and it had carried him across half the country without failing once. He lowered himself down the steps backward, controlling the descent with his arms, the muscles across his shoulders and chest flexing beneath his coat. The chair's wheels hit the platform with a solid thunk. Cold air slapped him in the face. His breath clouded white. Red Willow spread out before him like a sketch someone had started and never finished. A main street of hard-packed dirt, lined with wooden buildings that leaned slightly, as if the wind had worn them down over time. A general store. A saloon with a painted sign so faded he could barely read the name. A church with a crooked steeple. Beyond that, scattered houses, smoke rising from chimneys, and then nothing but white. Snow-covered plains stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the skeletal shapes of distant trees. It was smaller than he'd expected, quieter. Behind him, the conductor began unloading luggage and crates. Elias rolled forward, scanning the platform. She'd said she would meet him here. Margaret Larson. Widow, age 31, looking for a partner to help run her late husband's freight business. They'd exchanged letters for 4 months. She knew about the chair. He'd been clear about that from the start, hadn't hidden anything. She'd written back saying it didn't matter, that she needed someone capable and honest, and that strength came in many forms. He'd believed her. A small crowd had gathered near the station house, maybe a dozen people, bundled in coats and scarves. They weren't there for the train. They were there for a spectacle. He could tell by the way they stood, the way they whispered to each other. Then he saw her. Margaret Larson stood at the front of the group, a tall woman in a dark blue dress and a wool coat, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was handsome in a severe sort of way, with sharp cheekbones and pale eyes that locked onto him the moment he came into view. Elias rolled toward her, weaving around a stack of crates. His hands were already cold, even through his gloves. He stopped a few feet in front of her and met her gaze. "Miss Larson." She didn't say anything. Her expression didn't change. The crowd had gone silent. He cleared his throat. "I'm Elias Crow. We've been writing. I know who you are." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something hard and final. The air seemed to tighten. "I wasn't expecting—" She gestured vaguely at the chair, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "You said you were injured. You didn't say you were like this." Heat crawled up the back of his neck. "I told you I couldn't walk. I was clear. You said you were capable. I am. A man who can't stand on his own isn't capable of running a freight business." She said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. I need a partner, a whole partner, not half of one. The words landed like a punch. Elias sat very still. Somewhere behind him, someone coughed. A child whispered something and was shushed. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, weighing him, judging him, watching to see what he would do. Margaret Larson took a step back. I'm sorry you came all this way, but this won't work. She turned and walked away, just like that. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring to each other, shaking their heads. A few of them glanced back at him. Pity, curiosity, maybe a little relief that they weren't the ones sitting in that chair, being humiliated in front of the whole town. Elias didn't move. He sat there on the platform, the wind cutting through his coat, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles went white. He'd sold everything he owned to get here. Every tool, every piece of furniture, everything except what he'd packed into 2 trunks and loaded onto the train. He'd burned his bridges in Pittsburgh, quit his job, said goodbye to the few people who still spoke to him, walked away from the only life he'd known. And for what? To be rejected in front of strangers by a woman who'd promised him a future? He could leave, buy a ticket on the next train out, go somewhere else, start over again. But something in him, something stubborn and contrary and maybe a little bit angry, refused. He stayed. The Red Willow Inn was a squat 2-story building at the east end of town, with a sagging porch and windows that rattled in their frames. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Calloway, was a round-faced widow in her 50s with flour on her apron and skepticism in her eyes. "You got money?" she asked, looking him up and down. Elias pulled a small roll of bills from his coat pocket and set it on the counter. She took it, counted it, and nodded. "Room's upstairs, second door on the left." Upstairs. That a problem? No. It was, but he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of saying so. She handed him a key. "Supper's at 6. You miss it. You don't eat." Understood. Getting upstairs took 20 minutes. The staircase was narrow and steep, and there was no railing on one side. He had to transfer out of the chair, haul himself up step by step using his arms, then pull the chair up behind him. By the time he reached the top, his shoulders were burning and his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a washstand, a window that looked out over the street. The walls were thin enough that he could hear someone coughing in the next room. He sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. This was a mistake. He knew that now. Coming here, trusting a stranger's letters, believing that someone might actually see past the chair and judge him on what he could do instead of what he couldn't. But he was here, and he'd be damned if he was going to slink away like a dog with its tail between its legs. The next morning, he went looking for work. Red Willow didn't have much, but it had a livery stable, a smithy, a mill, and a freight depot, all places that needed things fixed, maintained, built. Elias had spent 15 years working with his hands, first as an apprentice machinist, then as a toolmaker, then as a freelance engineer taking on whatever jobs came his way. He knew metal, wood, mechanics, and mathematics. He could look at a broken piece of equipment and see not just what was wrong, but how to make it better. The livery owner, a grizzled man named Hackett, took one look at the chair and shook his head. "Can't use you." "You haven't asked what I can do." "Don't need to. I need someone who can lift bales, muck stalls, handle horses. You can't do any of that." "I can repair your wagon axles. I can rebuild your harness rigging. I said no." The smithy was worse. The man didn't even let him finish his introduction before waving him off. By midday, Elias had been turned away from every business on the main street. Most didn't bother with excuses. They just looked at the chair and said no. He sat outside the general store, cold and frustrated, watching the town go about its business. People walked past without meeting his eyes. A few nodded, polite, distant, the kind of acknowledgement you'd give to a stray dog. Then he heard the voice. Well, look what we got here." Elias turned. A man stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a smirk on his face. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with thinning brown hair and a belly that strained against his vest. Lloyd Garrett, according to the sign above the shop behind him, proprietor of Garrett's Goods and Sundries. "You're the cripple from yesterday," Lloyd said. "The one Larson sent packing." Elias didn't respond. Lloyd stepped closer. "Let me give you some advice, friend. This town's got no use for charity cases. You want to survive out here, you need to pull your weight, and I don't see how a man who can't even stand is going to do that. I pull my weight just fine. Do you now? Lloyd grinned. Tell you what, you show me you can stand up and walk across this street, and I'll hire you on the spot. A few passers-by had stopped to watch. Lloyd was playing to them, feeding off their attention. Elias met his gaze and didn't blink. I don't need your job. Good, 'cause you weren't getting it anyway. Lloyd laughed, a loud braying sound, and turned back toward his shop. Elias sat there, jaw tight, fists clenched. He'd dealt with men like Lloyd before, men who measured worth by the narrowest possible standard and enjoyed making others feel small. Arguing with them never worked. Proving them wrong did. He just needed a chance. That chance came 2 days later. The train station was a mess. The platform had warped over the winter, leaving gaps and uneven boards that made it nearly impossible for passengers with luggage to navigate safely. The station master, a wiry man named Pruitt, had complained about it to the railroad company for months, but no one had come to fix it. Elias rolled up to the station early one morning with a toolbox balanced on his lap and a plan in his head. Pruitt was inside sorting mail. He looked up when Elias knocked on the doorframe. Help you? I can fix your platform. Pruitt blinked. Excuse me? The boards are warped. You've got gaps. Someone's going to trip and break their neck. I can fix it. And what do you want in return? Nothing. Let me do it. And if you're satisfied, you can tell people I did good work. That's all. Pruitt studied him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. Knock yourself out. Elias spent the next 3 days at the station. He pulled up the worst boards, planed them down, shimmed the supports, and relayed everything flush and level. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was precise, and by the time he was finished, the platform was solid. Word got around. A few people stopped by to watch him work. Some asked questions. One man, a farmer named Stokes, asked if Elias could take a look at a plow blade that had cracked. I can weld it, Elias said. Stokes hired him on the spot. By the end of the week, Elias had 3 more jobs lined up. Small things, repairs mostly, but it was a start. And then he met Martha Hale. Right. She walked up to him while he was working on a broken pump outside the general store. He didn't notice her at first, too focused on loosening a rusted bolt that had seized up years ago. You the man who fixed Pruitt's platform? He looked up. She was a woman in her 40s, maybe, with dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a braid. She wore a simple dress and an apron stained with soap and water. Her hands were red and chapped, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of long hours and little sleep. That's me, Elias said. I'm Martha Hale. I run the laundry at the end of Birch Street. I know the place. I need help. My boiler's shot. It heats, but the pressure's uneven, and the whole thing shakes like it's going to blow. I've had 3 men look at it. None of them could figure it out. What do they know about boilers? Not much, apparently. Elias wiped his hands on a rag. I'll take a look. Chad. The laundry was a long, low building with steam pouring out of the vents and the sharp smell of lye soap in the air. Inside, 2 younger women were scrubbing clothes in big tubs while a third fed sheets through a mangle press. The noise was overwhelming. Water sloshing, metal clanking, the hiss and rumble of the boiler in the back room. Martha led him through the main room and into a smaller space where the boiler sat, a hulking iron cylinder with pipes running in every direction. It was shaking, just like she'd said, and the pressure gauge was swinging wildly between safe and dangerous. Elias rolled closer and studied it. When did it start? About a month ago. It's gotten worse. He ran his hand along one of the pipes, feeling the vibration. Then he checked the fittings, the valve, the water line. Your feed water regulator's clogged, he said after a few minutes. It's letting too much water in at once, then choking off. That's why the pressure's jumping. Can you fix it? Yeah, I'll need to pull the regulator, clean it out, maybe replace a gasket. Give me a couple hours. Martha nodded. What do you charge? Let's see if I can fix it first. It took 3 hours, not 2. The regulator was worse than he'd thought, corroded and packed with mineral buildup. He had to fabricate a new gasket from some rubber stock he'd brought with him and reseat the whole assembly. But when he fired the boiler back up, it ran smooth. The shaking stopped. The pressure gauge held steady. Martha stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. You did it. Told you I would. She walked over and inspected the boiler herself, then looked at him. What do I owe you? $2. That's too low. It's fair. She pulled $3 from her apron pocket and handed it to him. You earned it, and if you're looking for more work, I could use someone regular. Equipment here breaks down all the time, and I'm tired of waiting on men who don't know what they're doing. Elias hesitated. Regular work meant staying. It meant putting down roots in a town that had already made it clear he wasn't welcome. But it also meant money and respect, at least from one person. I'll think about it, he said. Martha smiled, just a little. You do that. That night, Elias sat in his room at the inn, counting his money. He had enough to last another 2 weeks, maybe 3, if he was careful. After that, he'd need steady income. He thought about Margaret Larson, about the way she'd looked at him on that platform. Half a man, she'd called him. He thought about Lloyd Garrett and his smug grin. He thought about Martha Hale, who'd hired him not because she felt sorry for him, but because he could do the job. And he made a decision. He wasn't leaving. Let them think what they wanted. Let them whisper and judge and write him off. He'd prove them wrong, one job at a time. But over the next few weeks, Elias became a fixture in Red Willow. He fixed a broken grain auger at the mill. He repaired a cracked stove at the schoolhouse. He rebuilt the hinge mechanism on the church door after it had been hanging crooked for months. People started to notice. Not everyone. Lloyd Garrett still made a point of sneering whenever he saw Elias on the street. A few others followed his lead, treating Elias like he was invisible, or worse, like he was something to be pitied. But others, like Pruitt, like Martha, like Stokes the farmer, began to see him differently. They saw the work. They saw the results. And slowly, grudgingly, a few of them started to see the man. One afternoon, Elias was working outside the livery. Hackett had finally relented and hired him to fix a busted wagon wheel, when a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, wandered over. "How come you don't got legs?" the boy asked. "Tommy!" A woman hurried over and grabbed the boy by the shoulder. "That's rude." "It's all right," Elias said. He looked at the boy. "I've got legs. They just don't work the way yours do." "Why not?" "Accident. Long time ago." "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes." The boy thought about that. "Can you still fix stuff?" "Yeah, I can fix stuff." "Cool." The woman dragged Tommy away, apologizing over her shoulder. Elias went back to work, but he was smiling. It was late March when things started to shift. Martha had hired him on permanently, 3 days a week, handling maintenance and repairs at the laundry. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and she treated him like an equal. They didn't talk much while they worked. Martha wasn't the chatty type, but there was a respect between them, an understanding. One evening after the other workers had left, Martha brought him a cup of coffee and sat down on an overturned crate. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. "Staying where?" "Here, Red Willow." Elias shrugged. "Haven't decided yet." "You should." She took a sip of her coffee. "Town needs people like you, people who actually know what they're doing. Town doesn't seem to want people like me. Some of them don't. Some of them do. You just gotta outlast the ones who don't." He looked at her. "That what you did?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Something like that." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hiss of the boiler and the wind rattling the windows. "Why'd you hire me?" Elias asked. "Because you fixed my boiler. You didn't know I could do that when you asked." Martha set down her cup. "I knew you weren't afraid to try. That's more than most people around here can say." Said, spring came slowly to Red Willow. The snow melted in patches, leaving the streets muddy and rutted. The wind lost its edge and the sun stayed out a little longer each day. Elias kept working. He built a ramp at the train station so passengers with trunks or carts could load and unload more easily. He repaired the town's only printing press. He even helped old Mrs. Calloway fix her stove when it started smoking. And people started to talk. Not all the talk was good. Lloyd Garrett, in particular, seemed to take Elias's growing reputation as a personal insult. He complained loudly at the saloon that Elias was undercutting local businesses. He spread rumors that Elias was a drifter, a con man, someone who couldn't be trusted. But the work spoke for itself. One day a man named Voss, a logger from one of the camps north of town, came looking for Elias. His crew's sawmill had broken down and they were losing money every day it stayed idle. "I heard you're the man to see," Voss said. "What's the problem?" "Drive shaft's cracked. We tried to weld it, but it keeps breaking." "Let me see it." Elias spent 2 days at the logging camp, fabricating a new shaft from salvaged steel and machining it to fit. It wasn't easy. He had to work in freezing temperatures with limited tools in a workshop that barely had a roof, but he got it done. When the mill roared back to life, Voss paid him double what they'd agreed on. "You ever need work?" Voss said. "You let me know." Word of that job spread fast. By early April, Elias had more work than he could handle. He was booked solid for weeks, and people were starting to come to him instead of the other way around. But not everyone was happy about it. Lloyd Garrett's resentment had been simmering for weeks, and it finally boiled over one afternoon at the general store. Elias had come in to buy supplies, nails, sandpaper, a new file. Lloyd was behind the counter, his face already red. "I don't serve cheats," Lloyd said. Elias set the items on the counter. "I'm not a cheat. You're stealing business from honest men. I'm doing work they can't do. You're a cripple playing at being useful." Lloyd's voice rose. "You got no right coming into this town and acting like you belong." The store went quiet. A few other customers turned to watch. Elias kept his voice level. "I've got every right, same as you." "You don't, you're broken, and sooner or later people are going to see that." Elias stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his supplies, dropped the money on the counter, and left. Behind him, Lloyd was still talking, still spitting venom, but Elias didn't look back. That night he sat in his room and thought about leaving again. It would be easier. Pack up, move on, find some place where people didn't already have their minds made up about him. But he'd worked too hard, built too much. And despite everything, despite Lloyd, despite the stares, despite the whispers, he'd started to feel something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged. Not because the town had accepted him, but because he'd proven, to himself, if no one else, that he didn't need their acceptance. He was enough, just as he was. The rain came in the 3rd week of April, turning Red Willow's streets into rivers of mud. It fell hard and cold, drumming against rooftops and pooling in every low spot, making the whole town smell like wet earth and rust. Elias woke to the sound of it hammering the window of his room at the inn, and he knew before he even got out of bed that it was going to be a miserable day. He was right. The streets were nearly impassable. His chair sank into the mud with every push, the wheels clogging, the frame getting heavier with each rotation. By the time he reached Martha's laundry, his arms were burning and his coat was spattered brown up to the shoulders. Martha was standing in the doorway, watching the rain sheet off the roof. "You're late," she said without looking at him. "Roads are bad." "I noticed." She stepped aside to let him in. "Boiler's acting up again. Started knocking this morning." He didn't bother taking off his coat, just rolled straight through to the back room where the boiler sat, ticking and groaning like something alive. He pressed his hand against the metal casing. It was hot, but not dangerously so. The knocking was coming from inside, rhythmic and insistent. "Water hammer," he said. "You've got air in the line." "Can you fix it?" "Yeah, need to bleed the system. Give me an hour." Martha nodded and left him to it. He worked in the heat and the noise, loosening valves, draining lines, listening to the way the water moved through the pipes. It was methodical work, the kind that let his mind wander. He thought about the jobs he had lined up for the week: a broken gate hinge at the schoolhouse, a cracked axle on a freight wagon, a roof repair at one of the houses on the edge of town. Enough to keep him busy, enough to keep him fed, enough to make Lloyd Garrett angrier. He'd seen Lloyd twice since their confrontation at the general store. Both times, Lloyd had made a point of turning his back, of talking just loud enough for Elias to hear, calling him names, making jokes. Elias had ignored it. There was no percentage in engaging with a man like that. Lloyd wanted a reaction. Elias wasn't going to give him one. But he knew it wasn't over. Men like Lloyd didn't let things go. They festered, and when they finally acted, it was usually ugly. By the time Elias finished with the boiler, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. He rolled back out into the main room, where Martha was overseeing 2 of her workers as they fed wet linens through the mangle. "All set," he said. Martha glanced at the back room, then at him. You look like hell. Feel like it too. She reached into her apron and pulled out a few bills. Take tomorrow off. You've been working every day for 2 weeks straight. I'm fine. You're not. You're worn out. Take the day. I mean it. He wanted to argue, but the truth was she was right. His shoulders ached. His hands were raw. And he was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle. All right, he said. Good. She handed him the money. Go get some rest, and for the love of everything, eat something that isn't dried meat and hard bread. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Outside, the streets were still a mess, but the rain had stopped. Elias made his way back toward the inn, avoiding the deepest puddles, his mind already on the prospect of a hot meal and a few hours of doing nothing. He didn't make it. Halfway down the main street, he heard shouting. It was coming from the direction of the freight depot, a low, sprawling building at the west end of town where wagons and supplies were stored. Elias turned and saw a small crowd gathering near the loading dock. He rolled closer. A man was yelling, red-faced and furious, gesturing wildly at someone Elias couldn't see. The crowd murmured, shifting, blocking his view. Then the crowd parted, and Elias saw who the man was yelling at. Margaret Larson. She stood with her arms crossed, her face pale but composed, while the man, a burly teamster named Doyle, jabbed a finger at her chest. You sold me a lame horse, Doyle shouted. That mare can't pull worth a damn, and you knew it. The horse was sound when she left my stable, Margaret said, her voice tight. If she's lame now, that's on you. Like hell it is. You're a cheat, Larson, just like your husband was. Margaret's jaw clenched, but she didn't back down. My husband ran an honest business. So do I. Honest? Doyle let out a bitter laugh. You can't even manage this place without running it into the ground. Maybe if you'd married someone who could actually help instead of chasing off the only man dumb enough to answer your ad. Elias didn't think. He just moved. He rolled forward, cutting through the crowd, and stopped between Doyle and Margaret. That's enough, Elias said. Doyle blinked, surprised. Then his face twisted into a sneer. Well, look who it is, the cripple. What are you going to do? Roll over my foot? A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Elias ignored them. You got a problem with the horse. Take it up with her like a man. Don't stand here screaming like a child. Doyle's face darkened. You got no business in this. I'm making it my business. For a moment it looked like Doyle might take a swing. His fists clenched, his shoulders bunched. But then someone in the crowd, Pruitt, the station master, stepped forward. Doyle, Pruitt said quietly. Walk away. Doyle glared at Elias, then at Margaret, then at the crowd. Finally, he spat into the mud and stalked off, shoving past people as he went. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring to each other, casting glances back at Elias and Margaret. Elias turned to her. You all right? Margaret's face was unreadable. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. I didn't need your help. I know. Then why did you do it? He thought about that. Because it was the right thing to do. She didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back into the depot, the door slamming behind her. Elias sat there in the mud, watching her go. He didn't expect thanks. Didn't want it, really. But something about the way she'd looked at him, like she couldn't quite figure him out, stuck with him all the way back to the inn. The next day, he took Martha's advice and rested. He stayed in his room, read an old newspaper he'd found in the lobby, and tried not to think about work. It didn't really work. His mind kept circling back to the jobs he had waiting, the things he needed to fix, the plans he was starting to make. He'd been in Red Willow for nearly 2 months now, and despite everything, it was starting to feel like something close to home. That feeling didn't last long. 2 days later, Elias was at the schoolhouse, fixing a broken hinge on the front door, when a boy came running up. Mr. Crow! Mr. Crow! Elias looked up. It was Tommy, the kid who'd asked him about his legs. What's wrong? There's a fight at the saloon. Mr. Garrett and some other men, they're saying stuff about you. Elias set down his tools. What kind of stuff? I don't know. Bad stuff. My ma said I shouldn't tell you, but I thought you should know. Elias nodded slowly. Thanks, Tommy. The boy hesitated, then ran off. Elias sat there for a moment, weighing his options. He could go to the saloon, confront Lloyd, make things worse, or he could ignore it, let Lloyd talk himself out, hope it blew over. He chose the second option. But the talk didn't blow over. Over the next week, Elias started noticing things. People who'd been friendly before, Stokes, Pruitt, even Mrs. Calloway, became distant. They still nodded when they saw him, still said hello, but there was a coldness to it now, a hesitation. And the jobs started drying up. A man who'd hired him to repair a plow came by and said he didn't need the work done after all. Another canceled a job fixing a fence. A third just stopped answering when Elias went to his house. At first, Elias thought it was coincidence. Then he heard the rumors. Lloyd had been busy. He'd been telling anyone who would listen that Elias was a fraud, that he didn't actually know what he was doing, that the work he'd done around town was shoddy, dangerous, likely to fail. He'd even claimed, without a shred of evidence, that Elias had been run out of Pittsburgh for stealing. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter when the person spreading the lies was loud and persistent and had lived in Red Willow his whole life. Elias confronted Lloyd one afternoon outside the general store. "You've been talking about me," Elias said. Lloyd grinned. "Have I?" "You know you have, and you know it's all lies." "I'm just telling people what I see. A drifter who showed up out of nowhere, charmed a few folks, and now thinks he owns the place. I've never claimed to own anything. You don't have to. You just roll around, fixing things, making the rest of us look bad. If I make you look bad, that's on you." Lloyd's grin faded. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Elias could hear. "You think you're clever. You think because you can fix a few broken machines, people are going to forget what you are. But they won't. You're a cripple. And sooner or later, they're going to remember that." Elias held his gaze. "And you're a coward. Sooner or later, they're going to remember that too." Lloyd's face went red. For a second, Elias thought he might actually hit him. But then someone called Lloyd's name from inside the store, and the moment passed. Lloyd stepped back, forcing a smile. "Get out of my sight." Elias turned and rolled away, his heart pounding. That night he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. He could leave. It would be easy. Pack his things, catch the next train, start over somewhere else. Somewhere Lloyd Garrett didn't exist. But he'd already started over so many times, and every time it got a little harder. He was tired of running. The next morning, Martha found him at the laundry, sitting by the boiler, staring at nothing. "You look like someone died," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" He told her. About Lloyd. About the rumors. About the jobs falling through. Martha listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat down on the same overturned crate she'd used before. "Lloyd's always been like this," she said. "He can't stand it when someone's better at something than he is, and you're better at damn near everything." "That doesn't help me pay rent." "No, but it tells you what kind of man he is." She paused. "You want my advice?" "I'm listening." "Don't leave. Don't give him the satisfaction. Keep doing what you're doing. The people who matter will see through his garbage eventually." "And if they don't?" Martha shrugged. "Then this town isn't worth staying in anyway." Elias thought about that. "You ever regret staying?" "Every damn day." She smiled, but it was sad. "But I'm still here. So are you. That's got to count for something." 2 weeks later, things came to a head. Elias was working on a wagon outside the freight depot, one of the few jobs he still had, when he heard glass shatter. He looked up. Across the street, smoke was pouring out of the window of Martha's laundry. He didn't hesitate. He dropped his tools and rolled as fast as he could toward the building, his arms pumping, his wheels kicking up mud. By the time he got there, flames were visible through the broken window. The front door was locked. "Martha," he shouted. No answer. He slammed his fist against the door. "Martha, are you in there?" Still nothing. People were starting to gather, drawn by the smoke and the noise. Someone yelled for water. Someone else ran toward the firehouse. Elias looked at the window. The flames were spreading fast, fed by the soap and alcohol stored inside. If Martha was in there, if anyone was in there, they didn't have much time. He backed up, got a running start, and rammed the door with his shoulder. It didn't budge. He tried again and again. On the fourth try, the lock gave way, and the door flew open. Smoke billowed out, thick and black, burning his eyes and lungs. He pulled his shirt up over his mouth and rolled inside. The heat hit him like a wall. He could barely see. Flames crawled up the walls, consuming everything they touched. "Martha!" He heard coughing, faint, coming from the back room. He pushed forward, navigating by memory, by feel. His wheels caught on something, debris, maybe a fallen beam, and he nearly tipped. He steadied himself and kept going. The back room was worse. The fire had started here, near the boiler. The ceiling was starting to sag. And there, collapsed on the floor near the far wall, was Martha. Elias rolled to her side. She was conscious, barely, her face streaked with soot, her breathing ragged. "Can you move?" he asked. She shook her head. He looked around. The doorway was already half blocked by fire. The ceiling groaned. He made a decision. He grabbed Martha under the arms, hauled her onto his lap, and started back toward the door. She was heavy, dead weight, and the chair wasn't built for this. The wheels slipped. The frame creaked. His arms screamed. But he didn't stop. He got her to the doorway just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and ash. Outside, hands reached for them. People pulled Martha away, laid her on the ground, checked her breathing. Someone threw a blanket over her. Elias sat there, coughing, his lungs on fire, his arms shaking. Pruitt appeared beside him. "You all right?" Elias nodded, even though he wasn't sure it was true. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen," Pruitt said. Elias didn't answer. He was watching the laundry burn. The fire brigade arrived too late to save the building. By the time they got the flames under control, the laundry was a smoldering ruin. Martha's livelihood, everything she'd built, was gone. She was taken to the doctor's house to be treated for smoke inhalation. Elias went with her, refusing to leave until he knew she was all right. The doctor, an older man named Carlson, checked her over and declared that she'd be fine. Shaken, bruised, but fine. "You saved her life," Carlson said to Elias. Elias didn't say anything. When Martha was strong enough to sit up, she looked at him. Her eyes were red, but not from the smoke. "Why'd you do that?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Because you're my friend." She nodded slowly. Then she started to cry. Elias sat with her until she stopped. The next day, the whole town was talking about the fire. Some said it was an accident, a spark from the boiler, a careless mistake, but others weren't so sure. Elias went to inspect the wreckage himself. He found what he was looking for near the back wall, half buried in ash. A kerosene can. Empty. He showed it to Pruitt. "Someone set this," Elias said. Pruitt's face went pale. "You sure?" "I'm sure." "Who would do something like that?" Elias didn't answer, but he had a pretty good idea. That evening, he rolled into the saloon. It was crowded, loud, full of men drinking and playing cards. The room went quiet when he entered. Lloyd Garrett was sitting at a table near the back, a half-empty bottle in front of him. Elias rolled straight to him. "We need to talk," Elias said. Lloyd looked up, his face flushed with drink. "I got nothing to say to you." "Then just listen." Elias kept his voice low, controlled. "I know you burned Martha's laundry." The room went dead silent. Lloyd laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're out of your mind." "Am I?" "Because I found a kerosene can in the wreckage, and I'm willing to bet if I ask around, someone saw you near that building yesterday." Lloyd stood up, knocking his chair back. "You calling me an arsonist?" "I'm saying if you had a problem with me, you should have come to me, not gone after an innocent woman." Lloyd's face twisted with rage. "You think you're so much better than everyone else? You think because you can fix a few things, people owe you something. But you're nothing. You're a broken-down cripple who doesn't know when to quit." Elias didn't flinch. "And you're a liar and a coward. At least I know what I am." Lloyd swung. Elias saw it coming. He leaned back and Lloyd's fist sailed past his face. The momentum carried Lloyd forward, and he stumbled, crashing into a table. The room erupted. Men jumped to their feet, some trying to hold Lloyd back, others shouting. Elias turned and rolled out of the saloon. Behind him, he could hear Lloyd screaming his name. The morning after the confrontation at the saloon, Elias woke to find a rock through his window. Glass glittered across the floor of his room, catching the early light. The rock sat in the middle of the debris, a piece of paper wrapped around it and tied with string. He picked it up carefully, unwrapped the paper, and read the message scrawled in crude letters. Leave or burn like she did. His hands didn't shake. He'd expected something like this. Lloyd wasn't the type to let an insult stand, especially not one delivered in front of half the town. But seeing the threat written out, knowing that someone had stood outside the inn in the dark and thrown this through his window, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He folded the paper, tucked it into his coat pocket, and got dressed. Mrs. Calloway was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs, her face tight with worry. "I heard the glass break," she said. "What happened?" "Someone doesn't like me very much." "It was Lloyd, wasn't it? Or one of his boys?" Elias didn't answer. He rolled past her toward the door. "Mr. Crow," she called after him, "you should go to the sheriff." He stopped. "Red Willow doesn't have a sheriff." "Then the mayor, someone. You can't just let this go." "I'm not letting it go. I'm just not making it worse." He left before she could argue. Outside, the town was waking up. Shopkeepers swept their stoops. A wagon rattled past, loaded with lumber. Two women stood talking near the general store, their voices low and urgent. They stopped when they saw him and watched him roll by without a word. The whole town knew about last night, and they were choosing sides. Elias made his way to what was left of Martha's laundry. The building was a skeleton now, blackened timbers jutting up from a foundation of ash and stone. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, acrid and choking. A few people had come by to sift through the wreckage, looking for anything salvageable. There wasn't much. Martha was there, standing at the edge of the ruins, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "You shouldn't be out here," Elias said. She didn't look at him. "Had to see it. Had to see what's left. There'll be other work. You can rebuild." "With what money?" "I put everything I had into this place. Every dollar, every hour." Her voice cracked. "And now it's gone." Elias moved closer. "It's not gone. The building's gone. You're still here." She turned to face him, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of it. "I'm 53 years old, Elias. I don't have the strength to start over. You're tougher than you think." "Am I?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because right now I feel like giving up." He didn't have an answer for that, so he just sat with her in the silence, watching the smoke curl up from the ashes. After a while, she spoke again. "You think Lloyd did this?" "I know he did." "Can you prove it?" "Not in a way that would hold up, but I know." Martha nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the ruins, then at him. "Whatever you do, be careful. Lloyd's dangerous when he's cornered, and you just cornered him in front of the whole town." Elias thought about the rock, the note, the threat. "I know." The rest of the day was tense. Elias tried to work. He had a job repairing a gate at one of the houses on Birch Street, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept circling back to Lloyd, to the fire, to the choice he had to make. He could leave, take the threat seriously, pack his things, and disappear. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But he'd spent his whole life being smart and safe, and where had it gotten him? Run out of Pittsburgh after the accident, rejected by Margaret Larson, mocked by men like Lloyd Garrett. He was tired of running, tired of letting other people decide what he was worth. If Lloyd wanted him gone, Lloyd was going to have to work for it. That evening, Elias went to the saloon again, not to fight, not to make a scene, just to show that he wasn't afraid. The room went quiet when he entered, just like before. But this time, no one looked away. They watched him roll to the bar, watched him order a drink, watched him sit there nursing it like he had every right to be there. Lloyd was at his usual table, surrounded by his usual crowd. He saw Elias and his face darkened, but he didn't move. Didn't say anything, just sat there, glaring. Elias finished his drink, set the glass down, and left. It was a small victory, but it mattered. 2 days later, the town council called a meeting. Red Willow didn't have much in the way of formal government. The council was just a handful of businessmen who met once a month to argue about roads and taxes, and whose fence was encroaching on whose property. But when something big happened, a fire, a flood, a dispute that couldn't be settled privately, they convened and pretended to have authority. The meeting was held in the back room of the general store, and word spread fast. By the time Elias arrived, The room was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to see. Lloyd was there, of course, sitting near the front with his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. The council consisted of 5 men. Pruitt, the station master. Hackett, the livery owner. A merchant named Keller. A landowner named Voss, the same man whose sawmill Elias had repaired. And sitting at the head of the table, a gray-haired man named Burnham, who owned most of the buildings in town and fancied himself the unofficial mayor. Burnham banged a gavel on the table to quiet the crowd. "All right, settle down. We're here to address the fire at the Hale Laundry and the accusations that have been made." The room buzzed with murmurs. Burnham looked at Elias. "Mr. Crow, you've accused Lloyd Garrett of arson. That's a serious charge. Do you have proof?" Elias rolled forward. "I found a kerosene can in the wreckage. The fire started in the back room, near the boiler, but the boiler wasn't the cause. Someone poured accelerant and lit it." "And you think that someone was Lloyd?" "I know it was." Lloyd shot to his feet. "That's a damn lie. I didn't touch that building." Burnham held up a hand. "Mr. Garrett, you'll get your turn. Sit down." Lloyd sat, but his face was red with fury. Burnham turned back to Elias. "The kerosene can isn't proof. Could have been there for weeks. Could have been anyone's." "It wasn't there before. I've been in that building 100 times. I know what belongs and what doesn't." Keller, the merchant, leaned forward. "Even if that's true, it doesn't prove Lloyd did it. Unless you saw him, unless you have a witness." "I don't need a witness," Elias interrupted. "Lloyd's been spreading lies about me for weeks. He's made it clear he wants me gone. And now, the day after I confront him, Martha's laundry burns down. You think that's a coincidence?" "I think you're looking for someone to blame," Keller said. "And Lloyd's an easy target." "Lloyd's a coward who burns down buildings when he can't win an argument." The room erupted. People shouted, some in agreement, some in outrage. Lloyd was on his feet again, yelling something Elias couldn't hear over the noise. Burnham banged the gavel until the room quieted. "Enough! This isn't getting us anywhere." He looked at Lloyd. "Mr. Garrett, where were you the night of the fire?" "At home. Asleep." "Can anyone verify that?" Lloyd hesitated. "My wife." "Anyone else?" "No, but I didn't burn down that laundry. Why would I? I've got no quarrel with Martha Hale." "You've got a quarrel with me," Elias said. "So what? That doesn't make me an arsonist." Voss, the landowner, spoke for the first time. "Lloyd, you've been running your mouth about Crow for weeks. Everyone in this town knows it. You think we're all deaf?" Lloyd's jaw tightened. "Running my mouth isn't a crime." "No," Voss said, "but arson is. You got no proof. And you've got no alibi." The room went quiet. Burnham sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, without proof, there's nothing we can do. If someone saw Lloyd near the laundry that night, if there's evidence we're missing, then we can revisit this. But right now, all we've got is suspicion." "That's not good enough," Elias said. "It's all we've got." Burnham looked around the room. "Meeting's over. Everyone go home." The crowd began to disperse, grumbling, dissatisfied. Lloyd pushed his way out first, flanked by his friends. He didn't look at Elias as he passed. Martha was waiting outside when Elias emerged. She'd been listening from the doorway. "They're not going to do anything," she said. "No, they're not." "So what now?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't know. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Lloyd, about the fire, about the town, and the way it had turned on him so quickly. He'd thought he was building something here. Respect, a place, a future. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe Red Willow was never going to accept him. Maybe he was just fooling himself. He was still awake when he heard the screaming. It came from outside, high-pitched and frantic. He bolted upright, grabbed his chair, and rolled to the window. Down on the street, people were running toward the east side of town, shouting, pointing. Something was burning. Elias dressed as fast as he could and made his way downstairs. Mrs. Calloway was in the lobby, wringing her hands. "What's happening?" he asked. "I don't know. Someone said it's the old mill. Or maybe the school. I can't—" He didn't wait for her to finish. He pushed through the door and into the street. The fire was visible from a block away, flames licking up into the night sky. casting everything in orange and red. People were running toward it with buckets, with blankets, with anything they could carry. The fire brigade was already there, pumping water from the well, but it wasn't enough. The flames were too big, too fast. Elias got closer, and his heart sank. It was the school. The building was old, built from dry timber, and it was going up like kindling. Smoke poured from the windows. The roof was already starting to collapse. And then he heard it. A voice, faint and desperate, coming from inside. "Help! Somebody help!" The crowd froze. Everyone looked at each other, but no one moved. "There's someone in there!" a woman screamed. "It's too dangerous," someone else said. "The whole thing's coming down." Elias pushed forward. "Who's inside?" "A boy," the woman sobbed. "My boy. He went back for his books. I told him not to. I told him—" Elias didn't hear the rest. He was already moving. "You can't go in there," someone yelled. He ignored them. He rolled to the front door, which was hanging open, smoke billowing out. The heat was intense, even from a few feet away. Inside, he could see flames crawling up the walls, consuming the desks, the floor, everything. He took a breath, pulled his shirt up over his mouth, and went in. The smoke was blinding. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The heat was unbearable, searing his skin, making it hard to breathe. He heard the crack of wood splitting, the roar of the fire, and somewhere, faint and desperate, a child crying. "Where are you?" Elias shouted. "Here! I'm here!" The voice was coming from the back of the room, near the teacher's desk. Elias pushed forward, his wheels catching on debris, the floor beneath him creaking and groaning. Part of the ceiling collapsed to his left, showering him with sparks and ash. He found the boy huddled in the corner, coughing, his face streaked with soot and tears. He couldn't have been more than 7. "Can you walk?" Elias asked. The boy shook his head. "My leg. I think it's broken." Elias looked around. The doorway was still open, but barely. The fire was closing in, the floor starting to buckle. They had maybe a minute before the whole thing came down. He grabbed the boy, pulled him onto his lap, and turned back toward the door. The floor gave way beneath them. Elias felt the chair drop, felt the sickening lurch of empty space beneath the wheels. He threw his weight forward, grabbed the edge of a desk, and held on. The boy screamed. The chair teetered, half hanging over the hole that had opened up in the floor. With every ounce of strength he had, Elias pulled. His arms burned, his hands slipped, but he didn't let go. He hauled the chair back onto solid ground, adjusted the boy, and kept moving. The doorway was ahead. Flames surrounded it, but there was a gap, just barely wide enough. Elias lowered his head and pushed through. They burst out into the night, into the cold air, into the hands of a dozen people who pulled them away from the building. Behind them, the school collapsed with a roar, sending up a plume of sparks and smoke. Elias sat there, gasping, coughing, his lungs on fire. The boy's mother ran to them, sobbing, pulling her son into her arms. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Elias couldn't respond. He could barely breathe. Someone threw a blanket over his shoulders. Someone else pressed a cup of water into his hands. The crowd surrounded him, staring, murmuring, their faces lit by the dying flames. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Red Willow, they weren't looking at the chair. They were looking at him. The next morning, the whole town was talking about it. Elias Crow, the man they'd dismissed, the man they'd mocked, had risked his life to save a child. He'd gone into a burning building when no one else would. He'd done the impossible. People stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him he was a hero. The boy's mother brought him a pie. Pruitt clapped him on the shoulder and said he'd never seen anything like it. Even Hackett, the livery owner who'd turned him away months ago, came to him and said, "I was wrong about you." Elias didn't know what to say to any of them. He just nodded and kept moving. But not everyone was pleased. Lloyd Garrett had been conspicuously absent since the fire. No one had seen him at the saloon, at the store, anywhere. And when Elias finally did see him, it was in front of the general store, late in the afternoon. Lloyd looked like he hadn't slept. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. He stood there, staring at Elias, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you've won," Lloyd said quietly. "This isn't a contest." "Yes, it is. And you're making me look like a fool." "You're doing that yourself." Lloyd stepped closer. "I know you're trying to turn this town against me, telling people I burned down Martha's laundry, Now this fire. I didn't start that fire. Neither did I. Then who did? Lloyd's face twisted. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe someone left a lantern burning. But you don't care about that, do you? You just want to make me the villain. Elias shook his head. You made yourself the villain, Lloyd. I just stopped pretending otherwise. Lloyd looked like he wanted to say something else, but the words didn't come. He just stood there, his hands shaking, his face pale. Then he turned and walked away. Elias watched him go, and for the first time he didn't feel anger. He felt something closer to pity. That evening, the town council called another meeting. This time it was to discuss rebuilding the school. Donations were already coming in: money, lumber, labor. Everyone wanted to help. And at the center of it all was Elias. Burnham stood at the front of the room and addressed the crowd. We owe Mr. Crow a debt, not just for what he did last night, but for everything he's done since he arrived. He's proven himself to be a man of skill, courage, and character, and I think it's time we recognize that. The room erupted in applause. Elias sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to deny the shift he felt. The town was changing, or maybe he was just finally seeing it clearly. After the meeting, Martha found him outside. You did it, she said. Did what? Made them see you. He thought about that. I didn't do it for them. I know. That's why it worked. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. They stood there in the quiet, watching the stars come out over Red Willow, and Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The hope didn't last long. 3 days after the school fire, someone broke into Elias's room at the inn. He came back from working on the new school foundation to find his belongings scattered across the floor, his toolbox overturned, and his few personal items smashed. The wheelchair he kept as a spare, an older model he'd brought from Pittsburgh, had been bent beyond repair, the frame twisted, the wheels torn off. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. I heard the noise, she said. By the time I got up here, whoever it was had already gone out the back. Elias surveyed the damage without saying anything. His chest felt tight, but he kept his face neutral. Was it Lloyd? She asked. Probably. Or someone who works for him. You need to report this, to Burnham, to someone. And say what? I didn't see who did it. Can't prove anything. But everyone knows, knowing and proving are different things. He started picking up his tools, checking each one for damage. Most were fine. A few would need work. I'll handle it. Mrs. Calloway hesitated, then left him alone. Elias spent the next hour putting everything back in order. The spare chair was ruined, but he hadn't been using it anyway. The rest was just things. Things could be replaced. But the message was clear. Lloyd wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Elias went to the construction site where the new school was being built. A crew of volunteers had already gathered, farmers, shopkeepers, even a few of Lloyd's former drinking buddies who'd apparently decided that saving their consciences was more important than loyalty. They were laying the foundation, measuring out the frame, hauling lumber from the mill. Voss, the landowner, was overseeing the work. He looked up when Elias approached. Morning, Crow. Heard about what happened at the inn. Word travels fast. It does in a town this size. Voss set down his hammer. You think it was Garrett? I know it was. You gonna do something about it? Elias looked at the construction site, at the men working, at the skeletal frame of the building taking shape. I'm doing something about it right now. Voss nodded slowly. Fair enough. We could use your help with the framing if you've got time. Some of these boys don't know a level from a plumb line. Elias spent the rest of the day at the site, working alongside men who weeks ago wouldn't have given him the time of day. They asked his opinion on measurements, on angles, on the best way to brace the walls. And slowly, grudgingly, they started to listen. By mid-afternoon, the frame was taking shape. It wasn't perfect, nothing built by committee ever was, but it was solid. It would stand. During a break, one of the younger men, a farmhand named Cole, sat down next to Elias and offered him a canteen. You really went into that burning building, Cole said. It wasn't a question. I did. Weren't you scared? Elias took a drink and handed the canteen back. Terrified. Then why'd you do it? Because no one else was going to. Cole thought about that. Lloyd's saying you're making yourself out to be a hero, that you probably started the fire yourself just so you could look good putting it out. Elias felt a spike of anger but pushed it down. What do you think? Cole looked at him for a long moment. I think Lloyd's full of it. Then that's all that matters. But Lloyd's poison was spreading. Over the next few days, Elias heard the rumors. Some people were starting to question the timing of the fires. First Martha's laundry, then the school, and both times Elias had been there. Both times he'd played the hero. It didn't make sense if you thought about it for more than 2 seconds. But people didn't always think. They just listened to the loudest voice, and right now Lloyd's voice was carrying. Elias tried to ignore it. He kept working on the school, kept taking repair jobs, kept showing up and doing what he'd always done. But the doubt was there, lingering in the eyes of some of the townspeople, in the way conversation stopped when he rolled past. Martha noticed it too. They're turning on you again, she said one evening as they sat outside the remains of her laundry. She'd been coming here every day, sifting through the ash, salvaging what little she could. Not all of them. Enough of them. She tossed a charred piece of wood aside. Lloyd's smart. He knows he can't attack you directly anymore. Not after you saved that boy. So he's planting seeds, making people wonder. Let them wonder. That's not enough, Elias. You have to fight back. How? By spreading rumors of my own? By stooping to his level? By proving him wrong, again and again until there's no doubt left. Elias looked at the ruins, at the blackened timbers and broken stone. I'm tired, Martha. Tired of proving myself. Tired of fighting for every inch of respect. I know. She reached over and put her hand on his. But if you stop now, he wins. He knew she was right. But that didn't make it any easier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Elias was at the general store buying nails when he overheard 2 women talking in the next aisle. Did you hear? Lloyd's wife left him. No. When? Yesterday. Packed her things and took the morning train. Didn't say where she was going. What happened? Don't know for sure, but Emma saw her the day before with a black eye. And Lloyd's been drinking even more than usual. Elias felt his stomach turn. He'd known Lloyd was cruel, but hitting his wife was something else entirely. He finished paying and left the store. Outside, he found Pruitt talking with Burnham near the station. Pruitt, Elias said. Can I ask you something? Sure. Lloyd's wife. She really left? Pruitt's expression darkened. She did. Got on the eastbound train yesterday morning. Didn't have much with her, just a bag and a bruise. You think he hit her? I know he did. She told me herself while she was waiting for the train, said she couldn't take it anymore. Burnham crossed his arms. That's a private matter between a man and his wife. Not when he's beating her, it's not, Pruitt said sharply. Even so, she's gone now. Nothing we can do about it. Elias looked at Burnham. You knew he was doing this? I suspected. A lot of people did. And no one said anything? Burnham shifted uncomfortably. What were we supposed to say? It's not our business. It became your business the moment you let him get away with it. Watch your tone, Crow. Or what? You'll throw me out of town? Lloyd's been terrorizing people for months and you've done nothing. He burned down Martha's laundry. He probably started the school fire, too. And now his wife's gone because she was afraid for her life. But sure, let's keep pretending it's not our business. Burnham's face went red. You're out of line. No, I'm the only one who's been paying attention. Elias turned and rolled away before Burnham could respond. That night, Lloyd came looking for him. Elias was in his room at the inn, working on repairing a broken hinge, when he heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Then a fist pounded on the door. Crow, open up! Elias set down his tools and rolled to the door. He opened it to find Lloyd standing there, swaying slightly, his eyes red and wild. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves. You've been talking about me, Lloyd slurred. I've been telling the truth about you. There's a difference. You turned my wife against me. I've never even spoken to your wife. Liar! Lloyd lunged forward, grabbing the front of Elias's shirt. You poisoned her. You poisoned this whole damn town. Elias grabbed Lloyd's wrists and shoved him back. Lloyd stumbled, caught himself against the wall. You did this to yourself, Elias said. You hit your wife. You burned down Martha's laundry. You've been spreading lies about me since the day I got here. You want someone to blame? Look in a mirror. Lloyd's face twisted with rage. He charged. Elias saw it coming. He ducked to the side and Lloyd crashed into the door frame. Mrs. Calloway appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a fireplace poker. "Get out of my inn," she shouted at Lloyd. "Now!" Lloyd turned, breathing hard, his fists still clenched. For a moment it looked like he might go after her too. But then something in him broke. His shoulders sagged, his face crumpled. "This is your fault," he said to Elias, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of it." Then he turned and stumbled down the stairs and out into the night. Mrs. Calloway lowered the poker. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "He's going to hurt someone." "I know." "What are we going to do?" Elias didn't have an answer. The next morning, Lloyd didn't show up to open his store. By noon, people were starting to talk. By evening, someone went to check on him. They found him passed out in the back room, surrounded by empty bottles, the store in shambles. He'd trashed the place himself. Broken jars, spilled goods, shattered shelves. It looked like a storm had blown through. Burnham and Voss hauled him out and put him in the old root cellar behind the town hall. It was the closest thing Red Willow had to a jail. When he sobered up, they gave him a choice: leave town or face consequences for what he'd done. Lloyd chose to leave. Elias watched from across the street as Lloyd loaded his belongings onto a wagon 2 days later. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished. He didn't look at anyone as he climbed up onto the seat, took the reins. Just before he left, Margaret Larson appeared. She walked up to the wagon and said something to Lloyd that Elias couldn't hear. Lloyd shook his head, snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Margaret stood there watching him go, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and saw Elias. She crossed the street slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Crow," she said. "Miss Larson, I owe you an apology." Elias didn't respond. "I was wrong," she continued, "about you, about what I said when you arrived. I judged you without knowing you, and that was cruel." It was. She flinched slightly, but didn't look away. "I've been watching you these past months, watching what you've built here, the respect you've earned, the lives you've saved. You're more of a man than most of the people in this town, certainly more than I gave you credit for. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No, I don't expect it to. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Elias looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze and he saw genuine regret there. It didn't erase what she'd done, didn't take away the humiliation he'd felt standing on that train platform months ago. But it was something. "Thank you for saying that," he said finally. She nodded. "If you ever need anything, I won't." She nodded again, then turned and walked away. Elias sat there for a while, watching the empty street, thinking about how much had changed. Lloyd was gone. The town was rebuilding. People were starting to see him not as a burden or a curiosity, but as someone who belonged. It should have felt like a victory, and in some ways it did. But there was a hollowness to it too, because at the end of the day, he was still alone. That changed a week later. The new school was nearly finished. The roof was on, the windows installed, the desks being moved in. It would open in time for the fall term, and the whole town was proud of it. Elias was there putting the final touches on the front door when Martha arrived. She'd been scarce lately, staying with a friend on the other side of town, trying to figure out what to do next. "It looks good," she said, looking up at the building. "It does. You did most of this, you know. Without you, it wouldn't have happened. I just helped." "You did more than that." She hesitated. "Can we talk?" "About what?" "About what I'm going to do next." They walked, or rather, she walked and he rolled, to the edge of town where the plains stretched out in all directions. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I've been thinking about leaving," Martha said. Elias felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. "Where would you go?" "Don't know. East, maybe. Somewhere I could start fresh." "You could do that here." "Could I?" "The laundry's gone, Elias. I don't have the money to rebuild, and even if I did, I'm not sure I have the heart for it anymore." "So you're just going to give up?" "I'm tired, same as you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower. "What if you didn't do it alone?" Elias said finally. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we went in together? I've got some money saved. Not much, but enough to get started. You know the laundry business. I know how to build and fix things. We could make it work. You'd do that? If you would. Martha stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Why? Because you hired me when no one else would. Because you treated me like I was worth something. And because I don't want you to leave. Her eyes were shining, but she didn't cry. She just nodded slowly. All right, she said. Let's do it. They shook hands, and in that moment, something settled between them. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but partnership, trust, a shared understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Over the next few weeks, they started making plans. They found a plot of land on the north side of town where the old tannery used to be. It was cheap because it needed work, but that suited them fine. They drew up designs for a new laundry, bigger than the old one, with a workshop attached where Elias could take on repair jobs. Word got around and people started offering to help. Voss donated lumber, Pruitt helped with the grading. Even some of the men who'd been skeptical of Elias at first showed up with hammers and saws. It took 2 months to get the building up. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. The laundry had enough room for 4 washing stations, a pair of mangle presses, and a boiler that Elias had rebuilt from salvaged parts. The workshop had a forge, a workbench, and storage for tools and materials. They opened on a warm day in late August. Martha handled the laundry, Elias handled the repairs. And slowly, steadily, business came. Not everyone in town supported them. There were still a few who looked at Elias and saw only the chair, who whispered that he was taking advantage of Martha, that the business would fail. But most people saw something else. They saw 2 people who'd been knocked down and had chosen to get back up. They saw resilience, they saw hope, and they respected that. One evening, as they were closing up, Martha stopped Elias at the door. "You know what I realized today?" she said. "What?" "I'm happy. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy." Elias smiled. "Yeah, me too." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for not giving up on this town, on me. Thank you for the same." They stood there for a moment, 2 people who'd found each other in the hardest of circumstances, and Elias felt something shift inside him. The loneliness he'd carried for so long was still there, but it was smaller now, manageable. He wasn't whole yet. Maybe he never would be, but he was closer than he'd ever been. The happiness lasted through September and into October, when the first frost came and turned the plains white overnight. The laundry and workshop were doing steady business, enough to pay the bills and put a little aside. Martha had hired 2 local women to help with the washing, and Elias had more repair work than he could handle. They'd fallen into a rhythm, the kind that comes from working side by side with someone who understands you without needing explanations. But there was still something unfinished between them, something neither of them had quite named. It came to a head on a cold evening in late October. They were closing up for the day, Martha wiping down the workstations while Elias organized his tools in the workshop. The sun had already set, and the wind rattled the windows. "You ever think about the future?" Martha asked suddenly. Elias looked up from the wrench he was cleaning. "Sometimes? Why?" She set down her rag and leaned against the doorframe between the 2 rooms. "Because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. About what happens next. We've got the business running, we've got a roof over our heads. But is that all there is? What else do you want?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I want to know if this is just a partnership or if it's something more." The question hung in the air between them. Elias set down the wrench. He'd been avoiding this conversation, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was afraid of what it might mean. Afraid of being hurt again. Afraid of wanting something he couldn't have. "I don't know," he said honestly. Martha crossed her arms, not defensively, but like she was holding herself together. "That's fair. But I need to know where I stand, because if this is just business, that's fine. I can live with that. But if it's more than that, if there's a chance it could be more, then I need you to tell me." "Why?" "Because I'm 53 years old, Elias. I don't have time to waste guessing." He looked at her, really looked at her. She was tired, worn down by years of hard work and disappointment. But there was strength in her too, a resilience that matched his own. And somewhere along the way, without him quite realizing it, she'd become the person he thought about when he woke up in the morning and the last person on his mind before he fell asleep. "It's more," he said quietly. Her expression softened. For me too. They stood there in the quiet, the weight of the admission settling between them. It wasn't a grand declaration, wasn't wrapped up in poetry or romance. It was just the truth, simple and unadorned. So what do we do now? Martha asked. I don't know. I've never been good at this part. She smiled, just a little. Neither have I. Maybe we just keep going, see where it leads. That works for me. She walked over to him, leaned down, and kissed him on the forehead. It was brief, tentative, the kind of gesture that said everything without demanding anything in return. When she pulled back, Elias reached up and caught her hand. Stay, he said. I'm not going anywhere. No, I mean stay, here, with me, not just as a business partner. Martha looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she nodded. All right, it wasn't a proposal, wasn't a promise of forever, but it was a beginning. The weeks that followed were different. They still worked together, still bickered over the best way to fix a stubborn boiler or organize the storage room. But there was a warmth to it now, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. People in town noticed. Some of them approved, nodding knowingly when they saw Elias and Martha together. Others whispered behind their hands, scandalized by the idea of a widow and a man in a wheelchair building a life together. Elias and Martha didn't care what people said anymore. They'd both spent too much of their lives worrying about other people's opinions. They had dinner together most nights, sometimes at the inn, sometimes at the small house Martha rented on Birch Street. They talked about everything and nothing, her late husband, his accident, the business, the town, their childhoods. They laughed more than Elias had laughed in years, and slowly, carefully, they started to build something that felt like a future. But the past wasn't quite finished with them yet. It was early November when Margaret Larson came to the workshop. Elias was alone, working on a broken plow blade, when he heard the door open. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Miss Larson? He said, surprised. Mr. Crow, do you have a moment? He set down his hammer. What can I do for you? She stepped inside, glancing around at the tools, the workbench, the shelves lined with salvaged parts. Her eyes lingered on the wheelchair, on the way Elias had arranged everything within easy reach. I wanted to talk to you about something, she said. It's regarding the freight business. Elias waited, his expression neutral. He'd seen Margaret around town since Lloyd left, had exchanged polite nods, but they'd never had a real conversation. I've been running it on my own since my husband died, she continued, and I've managed, but just barely. The truth is, I don't have the skills he had. I can manage the books, handle the customers, but I don't know how to maintain the equipment. And without that, the business is going to fail. You're looking for someone to hire? I'm looking for a partner, someone who knows what they're doing, someone I can trust. Elias felt a flicker of old anger rise in his chest. You didn't trust me 6 months ago. I know, and I was wrong. I've already apologized for that, but I understand if it's not enough. She met his eyes, and he saw genuine regret there, mixed with something that looked like desperation. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to consider a business arrangement. You'd handle all the repairs and maintenance. I'd handle the operations and logistics. We'd split the profits 50-50. Why me? There are other men in this town who could do the work. Because you're the best. And because you've proven that you can be trusted. She paused. And because I need to make this right. What I did to you on that platform, what I said, it was cruel. I can't take it back. But maybe I can do something that matters now. Elias studied her face. The proud, severe woman who'd rejected him so publicly looked different now. Smaller somehow. Humbled by time and circumstance. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. Take all the time you need. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad you stayed. This town is better for it. I'm better for it. She left before he could respond. That evening, Elias told Martha about the offer over dinner. They were sitting in her small kitchen, eating stew and bread she'd made that afternoon. The fire crackled in the hearth, warming the room against the November chill. Martha listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, her fingers wrapped around her mug of tea. What do you want to do? She asked when he finished. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell her to go to hell. And the other part? The other part sees the opportunity. The freight business could set us up for years. We could expand the laundry, hire more workers, maybe even build a proper house instead of renting. Martha set down her mug and looked at him steadily. Then take the offer. Just like that? Just like that. You're not doing it for her. You're doing it for us. You're not angry that I'm even considering it? Why would I be? She wronged you, but she's trying to make it right. That takes courage. Martha reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers rough from years of hard work. You've spent months proving yourself to this town. You don't owe them anything anymore, but that doesn't mean you can't accept help when it's offered. And it doesn't mean you can't profit from it. Elias turned her hand over in his, tracing the calluses on her palm. You're wiser than I am. I've just lived longer, made more mistakes. I'm afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if I work with her, I'll be right back where I started. Being judged, being found wanting. You're not that man anymore. And she's not that woman. People change, Elias. We all do. He thought about that, about how much he'd changed since arriving in Red Willow, how much the town had changed him. All right, he said finally, I'll do it. The partnership with Margaret Larson started slowly, cautiously, like two people learning to walk on ice. Elias spent a few days each week at the freight depot, inspecting the wagons, repairing the harnesses, maintaining the equipment. Margaret handled the scheduling and the customer relationships, the paperwork, and the finances. They didn't talk much beyond what was necessary at first. The wounds were still too fresh, the history too complicated. But the work got done, and it got done well. Elias discovered that Margaret's late husband had let the equipment fall into serious disrepair. Axles were cracked, wheels were warped, harnesses were patched with twine and hope. It was a wonder the whole operation hadn't collapsed already. He threw himself into the work, rebuilding what could be saved and scrapping what couldn't. He designed new axle assemblies that could handle heavier loads. He reinforced the wagon beds. He even built a hydraulic lift system that made loading and unloading easier for the workers. Margaret watched him work, asked questions, took notes, and gradually, something shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect born from shared purpose. One afternoon in late November, as the first snow began to fall, Margaret brought him coffee while he was working on a stubborn wheel bearing. You didn't have to do that, Elias said, accepting the cup. I know, but you've been out here for 6 hours in the cold. Figured you could use it. He took a sip. It was strong and bitter, the way he liked it. Thank you. She leaned against the workbench, watching the snow fall through the open door of the depot. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you stay? After what I did to you, after how this town treated you, why didn't you just leave? Elias set down the coffee and went back to work on the bearing, his hands moving with practiced precision. I thought about it, more than once. But you didn't. No, I didn't. He paused, choosing his words. I spent most of my life running. After the accident, after I lost my legs, I ran from Pittsburgh because I couldn't stand the pity. Couldn't stand being the broken man everyone whispered about. I thought if I went somewhere new, somewhere people didn't know me, it would be different. And was it? At first, no. It was the same story, different town. People looked at the chair and made up their minds before I even opened my mouth. He got the bearing loose and held it up to the light, examining it for damage. But something was different here. Maybe it was Martha. Maybe it was just that I was tired of running. But I decided that if this town was going to reject me, they were going to have to do it while I was standing my ground. Or sitting my ground, I guess. Margaret smiled faintly at that. You could have made it easier on yourself. Left after the laundry burned, or after Lloyd came after you. Easier isn't always better. No, I suppose it's not. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of metal on metal and the whisper of snow falling outside. I was afraid, you know, Margaret said suddenly, when you showed up at the station. Elias looked up at her. My husband died 2 years ago, she continued, her voice quiet. He was everything to me. Strong, capable. The kind of man who could handle anything. And when he was gone, I felt like I'd lost not just him, but any chance of keeping the business going. So I did what desperate people do. I put out that advertisement, looking for a partner who could step into his shoes. And I wasn't what you expected. You weren't what I thought I needed. I looked at you and all I could see was another burden, another thing I'd have to take care of, another failure. She shook her head. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. You've already apologized. I know, but I needed to say it again because you deserved better than what I gave you. Elias studied her face, saw the genuine remorse there. We all do things we regret. I've made plenty of mistakes myself. Maybe, but you didn't make the mistake of judging someone before you knew them. I've done that too. Just not here. Margaret nodded slowly. I've been watching you these past months, watching the way you work, the way you treat people. You don't ask for special treatment. You don't use your disability as an excuse. You just do what needs to be done. That's all anyone can do. That's where you're wrong. Most people don't do what needs to be done. They do what's easy, what's comfortable. You do what's right, even when it costs you. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They went back to work, and the conversation ended. But something had changed. The wall between them had come down, just a little. By December, the freight business was running better than it had in years. Deliveries were on time, equipment failures were rare, and customers were satisfied. Word spread to neighboring towns, and soon people were coming from miles away specifically to hire Larson Freight because they knew the work would be done right. Elias's share of the profits was more than he'd ever made before. He and Martha were able to pay off their debts, invest in better equipment for the laundry, and start saving for the future. They talked about buying land, maybe building a house of their own. But more than the money, Elias felt something he hadn't expected. He felt valued, not just for what he could do, but for who he was. The people of Red Willow no longer saw him as the cripple who'd shown up uninvited. They saw him as Elias Crow, the man who'd saved a child from a burning building, the man who'd built 2 successful businesses from nothing, the man who'd earned his place through sweat and skill and stubborn refusal to quit. It wasn't perfect. There were still a few who looked at him with pity or disdain. Old habits died hard, and some people's minds would never change. But they were the minority now, their opinions drowned out by the chorus of respect he'd earned. Winter came hard that year, with snow piling up in drifts taller than a man and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the pipes overnight. The laundry and workshop had to close for a few days when the roads became impassable, the snow too deep for even the hardiest souls to navigate. Elias and Martha spent those days in her house, keeping the fire going and talking about their plans for the spring. They played cards. They read books aloud to each other. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall outside the window. I've been thinking about something, Martha said one evening as they sat by the fire, blankets wrapped around their shoulders. What's that? Expanding. There's a building for sale on Main Street. Used to be a bakery before the owners moved east. It's bigger than what we've got now, and it's in a better location, right in the heart of town. That would cost a lot. We've got the money. Or we will, once you get your next payment from Margaret. She turned to look at him, her face lit by the firelight. I know we've already taken risks, built the laundry, started the workshop, but I think this could be something bigger, something that lasts. Elias thought about it. The building she was talking about was prime real estate, the kind of location that could make or break a business. You really want to do this? I do, but only if you do. This is our life we're building, not just mine. He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, at the hope. She wasn't the same woman he'd met months ago, broken and defeated by the loss of her laundry. Neither was he the same man who'd arrived on that train platform, carrying nothing but anger and doubt. Let's do it, he said. They shook hands, sealing the deal the way they always did, and Martha laughed. We're crazy, you know that? Probably, but it's a good kind of crazy. Spring came slowly to Red Willow that year, the snow melting in uneven patches, turning the streets into rivers of mud once again. But this time, Elias didn't mind. The mud meant work, meant progress, meant life returning to the frozen world. They bought the building on Main Street in March, emptying their savings and taking out a small loan from Voss, who'd become something of a friend and mentor. The building needed work. The roof leaked, the floors were uneven, and the whole place smelled like stale bread and mice. But Elias could see the potential. They spent the next 2 months renovating. It was exhausting work that left them sore and covered in dust every night. But it was theirs. They designed the layout together, arguing good-naturedly about where to put the boilers, how to arrange the workstations, whether to install windows on the east or west side to maximize light. Elias built custom equipment, a more efficient mangle press, a ventilation system that pulled steam out without losing heat, workbenches at varying heights so he could reach everything from his chair. He installed ramps at every entrance, not just for himself, but for the elderly customers who struggled with steps. Martha hired more workers, training them in her methods, building a team that could handle the increased volume she was planning for. She negotiated contracts with the hotels in neighboring towns, with the mining camps, with anyone who needed regular laundry service. By May, the new laundry and workshop were ready to open. It was twice the size of the old place, with room to grow even more. The building sat on Main Street like a declaration, its fresh paint gleaming in the spring sun, its sign announcing to the world that Hale and Crow was here to stay. They held a celebration on opening day, inviting the whole town. It seemed like everyone came, bringing food and drink and congratulations. Tables were set up outside, laden with pies and roasted meats and fresh bread. Someone brought a fiddle, and music filled the air. Even Margaret Larson showed up, bringing a bottle of wine and a rare, genuine smile. "You've done well for yourselves," she said to Elias as they stood watching the celebration. "We have. I'm glad, truly." She paused. "You've changed this town, changed the way people think about what's possible. I just fixed things that were broken. You did more than that. You showed people that strength comes in forms they hadn't considered, that worth isn't measured by what's missing, but by what you do with what you have." Elias looked at her. "That why you really offered me the partnership? To learn a lesson?" Margaret laughed. "No, I offered it because I'm a businesswoman and you're the best mechanic in 3 counties. But the lesson came anyway." As the evening wore on and the crowd thinned, Elias found himself standing outside with Martha, looking up at the sign they'd hung above the door. The letters were bold and clear, visible from anywhere on the street. "You think it'll last?" Martha asked. "I think we'll make it last." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders. They stood there in the quiet, watching the last streaks of sunset fade from the sky, watching the first stars appear. "You know what I realized?" Martha said after a while. "What?" "I don't remember the last time I felt alone." Elias smiled. "Me neither." They stayed there until the cold drove them inside, where the fire was warm and the future was waiting. The months that followed were some of the best of Elias's life. The business thrived beyond their expectations. The laundry was constantly busy, with customers coming from towns 20 miles away. His workshop became known throughout the region as the place to go when something needed fixing, and fixing right. His partnership with Margaret brought in steady income and exposed him to clients he never would have met otherwise. Wealthy ranchers, mining company executives, even a representative from the territorial government who wanted to discuss a contract for maintaining equipment along the new railroad line being built to the west. The money was good, better than good. But what mattered more was the respect. People sought out his expertise. They valued his opinion. They treated him like the skilled craftsman he was. His relationship with Martha deepened into something solid and enduring, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They didn't need grand gestures or passionate declarations. They had something better: partnership, trust, the quiet comfort of knowing someone had your back. They still argued sometimes, usually about trivial things like whether to reorganize the storage room or which supplier to use for soap. But even the arguments felt good, felt normal, felt like what life was supposed to be. But on a warm evening in late August, almost exactly a year since they'd opened the first laundry together, Elias realized he wanted more than just partnership. They were sitting on the porch of the small house they'd just bought together, a modest place on the edge of town with a view of the plains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that made the whole world look like it was on fire. Martha was talking about her plans for the business, about hiring another worker, about maybe opening a second location in one of the neighboring towns. Elias was only half listening, too caught up in watching the way the sunset lit up her face, the way her hands moved when she talked, the way she'd become the center of his world without him quite realizing when it had happened. "Martha," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Yeah? Will you marry me?" She stopped talking, turned to look at him. For a moment she just stared, her expression unreadable. "Are you serious?" she asked finally. "I am." "Why now?" "Because I don't want to wait anymore. Because you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Because when I think about the future, you're in every part of it. He reached out and took her hand. Because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that rare, full smile that transformed her entire face. You love me? I do. Since when? I don't know. Maybe since you hired me to fix your boiler. Maybe since you sat with me outside the ruins of your laundry and decided to trust me. Maybe since the first time you looked at me and saw a person instead of a disability. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was laughing too. You're a damn fool, Elias Crow. Is that a yes? Of course it's a yes, you idiot. She pulled him close and kissed him, hard and desperate, and full of all the things they'd never quite said out loud. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered, in case that wasn't clear. It's clear now. They got married in September in a small ceremony at the new school they'd helped rebuild. Half the town showed up, cramming into the building until there was barely room to breathe. Pruitt walked Martha down the aisle, his eyes suspiciously bright. Voss stood as Elias's witness, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was clearly too small for him. Even Margaret Larson came, sitting in the back with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes, crying quietly through the entire ceremony. The ceremony was simple, officiated by Burnham, who'd been authorized as a territorial justice of the peace. There were no elaborate decorations, no fancy clothes. Martha wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself. Elias wore his best shirt and vest, freshly cleaned and pressed. But it was theirs, and it was perfect. When Burnham pronounced them married, the room erupted in cheers. People threw rice and flower petals. Someone played a joyful tune on the fiddle, and Elias, sitting there in his chair with Martha's hand in his, felt a happiness so complete it took his breath away. Afterward, they had a party at the laundry, with food and music and dancing that went on into the night. Elias didn't dance, couldn't really, but he sat at the edge of the room and watched Martha laugh and spin with her friends, and he felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. At one point, Tommy, the boy he'd saved from the burning school, now a gangly 10-year-old with his father's height and his mother's eyes, came up to him. Mr. Crow, Tommy said, unusually serious, I just wanted to say thank you. Again. You already thanked me, Tommy. More than once. I know. But I wanted to say it again because you didn't have to do what you did. You could have let someone else try. But you went in anyway. Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You would have done the same if you could. I hope so. I hope if I'm ever in a situation like that, I'm brave enough. Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are scared. Tommy nodded thoughtfully, then ran off to join the other children. Elias sat there thinking about what he'd said, about what it meant. The truth was, he had been terrified going into that burning building. Every instinct had screamed at him to stay back, to let someone else handle it. But he'd gone in anyway because a child's life was at stake, and no one else was moving. And maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe strength wasn't about what you could or couldn't do physically. Maybe it was about choosing to act when it mattered, even when you were scared, even when the odds were against you, even when everyone expected you to fail. He thought about the man he'd been when he arrived in Red Willow. Broken, angry, convinced that the world had nothing left to offer him, certain that he'd used up all his chances, and this was just another stop on a long road to nowhere. He'd been wrong about all of it. The world had offered him everything, a home, a business, a partner who'd become his wife, a community that had learned, slowly, painfully, but genuinely, to see past his limitations and judge him by his character. But more than that, it had offered him the chance to prove something to himself, that he was enough, that his worth wasn't determined by what he couldn't do, but by what he chose to do with what he had. As the party wound down and people began to drift home, calling out their congratulations and well wishes, Martha came over and sat beside him. Her hair had come loose from its pins and her cheeks were flushed from dancing. Tired? She asked. A little. You? Exhausted, but happy. Me too. More than I've ever been. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. They sat there in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need words to understand each other.
"What are you thinking about?" Martha asked after a while. "Just how far we've come, both of us. It's been quite a journey." "It has." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else would. For taking a chance on a stranger with a broken boiler and a chip on his shoulder." "You fixed more than my boiler, Elias. You fixed something in me I didn't even know was broken." They sat there as the last of the guests departed and the night settled over Red Willow, quiet and peaceful. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. In the years that followed, Elias and Martha built a life that was full and meaningful. The business continued to grow, expanding into new services and new markets. They hired more workers, became one of the largest employers in Red Willow. Young people came to apprentice under Elias, learning his methods, his precision, his philosophy that anything worth doing was worth doing right. The freight business with Margaret flourished as well. They added more wagons, more routes, eventually even secured a contract with the railroad to handle freight transfers at the Red Willow station. Margaret and Elias became genuine friends, the awkwardness of their history fading into something resembling mutual affection. Elias never forgot where he'd come from. He never forgot the people who'd helped him along the way, Martha most of all, but also Pruitt and Voss and even Mrs. Calloway at the inn, who'd let him stay those first difficult weeks when he had nowhere else to go. And he never forgot of the ones who'd tried to tear him down, because they'd taught him something important too. They'd taught him that other people's limitations didn't have to be his own, that the opinion of those who judged without knowing was worthless, that the only approval that mattered was the approval he gave himself. He became a fixture in Red Willow, respected and valued not despite his disability, but because of who he was as a person. When the town needed something built or fixed, they came to him. When someone was in trouble, he helped. Not because he owed anyone anything, but because that was who he'd chosen to be. One spring afternoon, 5 years after he'd first arrived in Red Willow, Elias was working in his shop when a young man rolled in using a wheelchair that looked like it had seen better days. The man was maybe 20, with nervous eyes and hands that fidgeted with the wheel rims. "Mr. Crow?" the young man said. "That's me. My name's Daniel. I came all the way from Cheyenne. I heard about you, about what you've done here, and I—" He trailed off, looking uncertain. "You what?" "I wanted to see if it was true, that a man like us could make it." Elias set down his tools and really looked at the young man. He saw himself in that face, the doubt, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world for someone like him. "Come here," Elias said. Daniel rolled closer. Elias gestured around the workshop, at the tools hung neatly on the walls, at the projects in various states of completion, at the well-worn but meticulously maintained workspace. "This is what making it looks like. It's not pretty. It's not easy. There's no magic to it. You just show up every day and do the work. You prove yourself through your actions, not your words. And you don't let anyone else define what you're capable of. But how do you deal with the people who don't believe in you? You outlast them. You prove them wrong so thoroughly that they can't ignore you anymore." Elias paused. "But more importantly, you stop caring what they think. The only person you need to prove anything to is yourself." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Can I ask you something else?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever get angry? At the unfairness of it all?" Elias thought about that. "Used to, every day. I was furious at the world, at fate, at the accident that took my legs. I thought I'd been robbed of the life I was supposed to have. And now? Now I realize I wasn't robbed of anything. I just got a different life than I expected. Harder in some ways, better in others. And it's the only life I've got, so I might as well make it count." Daniel stayed for the rest of the afternoon, watching Elias work, asking questions, slowly losing some of the fear that had been etched into his face. When he finally left, he looked different, straighter, more hopeful. "Thank you," he said at the door. "For what?" "For showing me it's possible." After he left, Martha came into the workshop. She'd been listening from the doorway. "That was kind, what you did for him," she said. "I just told him the truth. You gave him hope. That's more than the truth. That's a gift." Elias thought about all the gifts he'd been given since arriving in Red Willow. The chance to prove himself, the opportunity to build something meaningful, the love of a woman who saw him for who he truly was.
and he thought about the gift he could give others. The simple but profound gift of showing that a different kind of life was possible. That limitations were often just other people's expectations. That worth wasn't measured in conventional ways. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the day was fading, Elias would sit on the porch of the house he and Martha had built together. A real house now, larger than the first one, with a workshop attached and a view that stretched for miles. He'd look out over the plains and think about the journey that had brought him here. All the pain, all the struggle, all the moments when he'd wanted to give up, when quitting seemed easier than fighting. And he'd realize he wouldn't change a thing, because it had made him who he was. The story people told about Elias Crow became a legend in Red Willow. The man who'd arrived with nothing and built an empire. The hero who'd saved a child from a burning building. The skilled craftsman whose work was sought after throughout the territory. But those stories, as much truth as they contained, missed the real point.
Elias Crow wasn't a hero. He wasn't extraordinary. He was just a man who'd refused to let anyone else define his worth. Who'd chosen to measure himself by his actions, not his limitations. Who'd understood that strength comes in many forms, and the truest form is simply the courage to keep going when it would be easier to quit. He was a man who'd been called incomplete, broken, half a man, and he'd proven, day after day, year after year, that those labels were meaningless. Because he'd always been whole. He just needed the chance to show it. And in a frozen frontier town that had tried to reject him, he'd found not just acceptance, but something far more valuable. He'd found himself, the real Elias Crow, not the one shaped by other people's expectations or limited by other people's fears. The man who could look in the mirror and know, without doubt or hesitation, that he was exactly who he was supposed to be. That was the legacy he left. Not the businesses he built or the lives he saved, but the simple, powerful example of a person who refused to accept anyone else's definition of possible. Years later, when Martha asked him what he was most proud of, he thought for a long time before answering. "That I stayed," he said finally. "That I didn't let them win." "They never had a chance of winning," Martha said. "Not against you." Maybe she was right. Maybe the outcome had been inevitable from the moment he'd made that first stubborn choice to stay in Red Willow despite everything. Or maybe it had been a close thing, balanced on a knife's edge, and he'd just been lucky enough or stubborn enough to tip the scales in his favor. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd done it, built a life, earned respect, found love, proved that a man's worth wasn't determined by what he'd lost, but by what he chose to do with what remained. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.